How do ideas have sex? And why does that matter for innovation? Why do brains tend to systematically misread the future? Why do we feel that the world is getting worse when, by almost all the measures we can make, it's getting better? What if optimism is actually the more rational stance? Is optimism a personality trait, or can it be evidence-based? If innovation isn't primarily about lone geniuses, what is it really about? Today, we're joined by scientist and author Matt Ridley as we talk about what it means to be, in Ridley's term, a rational optimist. Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and an author at Stanford, and in these episodes, we sail deeply into our 3-pound universe to understand some of the most surprising aspects of our lives. So let's start with a question. What story do you tell yourself about the future? Because we all carry around a narrative, an internal model about where things are headed, and that story shapes everything. It shapes our moods, our decisions, our sense of what is possible. Now, one of the facets of history that I've always found the most fascinating is that every generation believes that it's living through uniquely perilous times. Every generation feels the shadow of something large and ominous hanging overhead, something that makes this moment more fragile, more dangerous, and more on the brink than anything that came before. Just as a personal example of this, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, there was a very specific cloud hanging over everything, and that was nuclear annihilation. When I was a kid, we all watched a film called The Day After, and if you saw that, you know that it represented the zeitgeist of that time, which was that the world was going to end. Not with a whimper, but a bang in a very specific way, and it was going to happen any year now. So in my school, we practiced drills where we would get under our desks. Now, I think even as kids, we appreciated at least somewhat that this wasn't really going to help. If a nuclear bomb dropped, a little desk wasn't going to give us much protection. But still, we did the drills because it was part of the atmosphere, this kind of ambient anxiety that everyone shared at the time. So there were big concerns like nuclear war, and there were more local concerns too, like television sets, and parents were worried about it constantly. In case younger listeners don't know this, the television used to be called the boob tube, from whence we get the pun YouTube. The word boob meant an idiot or a fool, and that encapsulated this fear that the television was going to make everyone lose major IQ points. Kids would stop going outside, no more imagination, no more creativity. Instead, the kids were going to sit drooling in front of Gilligan's Island or Love Boat, spooning TV dinners into their mouths and becoming passive consumers of flickering images, similar to the way that we talk about social media now. And as an interesting side note, when the printing press was invented in the 15th century, a lot of thinkers were concerned that that was going to make kids stupider, because now instead of having to remember things, they could just pick up the book off the shelf and find the answer there. Anyway, back to the 1980s, there were fears about drugs, about cultural collapse, about population explosion and mass starvation. So every era sits under its cloud of existential threats, and I'm not dismissing these. It's not that these threats aren't real and urgent. The only point I want to make for now is that those fears feel difficult or impossible to solve when you are inside them. But when you step back and look at the data, we always get surprised. Problems get solved by innovation, at least so far, every single time. This is a pattern we see again and again. Confident predictions of decline that don't play out. In fact, across the entire globe, the large-scale trends are clear. You find massive declines in poverty, increases in lifespan, improvements in health, expansions in access to knowledge and technology. But here's the fascinating thing that we're going to talk about today. If you tune into your own mind, especially as you scroll through the news, you might feel something very different. You get a sense that things are deteriorating, that everything is heading in the wrong direction. So what is going on here? Well, from a neuroscience perspective, this is not surprising because the brain is a prediction machine that is tuned to detect threats. If we think in evolutionary terms, missing something dangerous had consequences measured in survival. So the system leans heavily towards vigilance, and this is why bad news carries a lot of attentional weight. With good news, it's totally different. The moment something gets better, the moment it genuinely improves, it becomes invisible. It just becomes part of the new baseline. So look at the things that would have seemed like miracles to our great-great-grandparents, things like electrification of the nation, or clean water, or antibiotics, or global instant communication. Any one of these would have seemed like a science fiction miracle. And now they're just the way that things are. We just flick a switch or we dial the faucet, and we essentially never think twice about the fact that we're bringing daylight into our home at nighttime, or we're diverting a clean little river of water right to us whenever we want it. So, our brains build models of a world that feels more dangerous than it statistically is, and a future that feels more precarious than it actually might be. Today, we're going to explore this tension through the lens of someone who has spent years thinking deeply about it, the scientist and author Matt Ridley. He's written many books on topics from genomes to technology, but of special interest today is his book called The Rational Optimist. Ridley earned his doctorate in zoology at Oxford and has gone on to do many things, including serving as an editor for The Economist and serving in the British House of Lords on the select committees for science and technology and AI. So we're going to zoom in on this topic of rational optimism because generally when we talk about optimism, it sounds like we're talking about temperament, like some people are just wired to be upbeat. But Ridley's argument has been different. He's all about grounding his optimism in evidence. He studies long-term measurable changes that reveal something about how human societies evolve over time. Here's my conversation with Matt Ridley. So, Matt, let's start broadly. When you say rational optimism, what is that? What can make optimism rational instead of just hopeful?
The answer to that is evidence. In other words, I'm optimistic about the future not because I'm hopeful or I have a positive mood. It's because the extraordinary improvements in human living standards in almost every way you can imagine that have happened in my lifetime and in nobody else's lifetime before that are set to continue and are something worth noting and celebrating. And by the way, are also in sharp contrast to the gloomy predictions that the adults always make at every stage.
Why do you think that humans are so drawn to pessimism, even in eras of measurable progress?
It's an extraordinary phenomenon, and we tend to think it's new, that the gloom and doom of today wasn't the way people thought in the 60s or 70s. But I think it goes back a very long way, and it speaks to something in human nature. I mean, that's why fire and brimstone preachers were such a success in previous centuries. And there's several reasons, I think, for this. One is that bad news is more salient. You know, if something catastrophic is going to happen, you want to hear about it. If something good's going to happen, you don't necessarily need to know about it. So we are more alert to that. And there's lots of evidence that given the choice between bad news stories and good news stories, people prefer to read the bad news stories. And you know, editors know that. Television producers know that, everybody knows that. So, of course, they feed into that and they therefore make it worse. The second reason is that the more we know about a situation, the cheerier we are. So people are actually quite optimistic about local things in their lives, about the success of their own careers and marriages, about the success of their own town or village. But the bigger the unit you look at, the more pessimistic they get. So the relying on news sources for that and not on their own experience when they think about the world. But there's another evolutionary psychology reason, I think, here, which is that we're always in competition with each other. And the person who was alert to bad news probably survived bad periods in prehistory better. You and I walking to the waterhole on the savannah 100,000 years ago, you say, I don't think we should go this way. There might be a lion behind those rocks. And I say, no, everything's getting better. I've just read a book about it. Your genes are in the next generation at the expense of mine and probably via my girlfriend.
So when you look across the centuries, what do you see as the strongest evidence that the world is improving?
I think the big one is poverty. There's a wonderful experiment that Hans Rosling did, was he asked 1,000 people in America, and they then repeated this in lots of other countries. Do you think that the percentage of the world population that lives in extreme poverty has doubled, halved, or stayed the same in the last 20 years? 65% of people said it had doubled, 5% said it had halved. The 5% were right, the 65% were wrong. But when you think about it, if you wrote those three answers on 3 bananas and threw them into a cage with a monkey in it, the monkey would pick up the correct answer to that question 33% of the time, not 5% of the time. So it would do 6 times as well as human beings in answering this question about human society, which is a pretty amazing fact when you think about it. There's a wonderful quote from Josh Billings, a 19th century sage, who said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that ain't so." And so in my lifetime, the percentage of the world living on less than $1.90 a day in 2011 dollars has gone from 50%, half the world living on that extremely low level of income, to about 8%. Now, nobody has ever lived through a transformation like that. And of course, money isn't everything, but that's a measure of how many of your needs you can fulfill. And it goes along with incredible improving lifespan going up at the rate of 7 hours a day at the moment globally. Falling child mortality, but we're not just wealthier, we're healthier, happier, cleverer, kinder, freer, more peaceful, and more equal. People are very surprised when you say this, but for the last 50 years, people in poor countries have been getting rich much faster than people in rich countries. And that really does make a difference to equality.
What are the metrics of progress that you think people most consistently underestimate?
There's an extraordinary graph that Our World in Data has done, among other people, and it shows the distribution of income in the 1960s, and it's a 2-humped camel. It has a great big hump of very poor people and a hump of rich Western middle-class people in Europe and America, and not much in between. And the big change of the last 50 years has been almost the whole of Asia moving into that middle chunk, so that it's now a 1-humped camel. Most of Africa hasn't yet made that move, but it's starting to, and it's doing so at roughly the speed that Asia did so a generation ago.
What is the reason Africa hasn't made that move yet, and what's it going to take to get there?
When I wrote The Rational Optimist in 2010, I got criticized by one reviewer because I used the phrase, even in Africa, things are getting better. And the reason I used that phrase was because I was reading people saying, look, Asia has had improved living standards. Africa's never going to achieve that. There's far too much population pressure, far too much poverty, far too much disease, far too much conflict. It's not realistic to expect it to go through a radical transformation in living standards. And I said, no, there's evidence that it is going to do that. And even in Africa, you are seeing these measures move in the right direction. And then I got criticized for being a racist by using this phrase, even in Africa, which was outrageous because I was saying exactly the opposite. But, people will do these kind of things. So Africa had lagged behind the rest of the world in terms of industrialization, in terms of trade. It has various geographical disadvantages. It doesn't have great places for ports, and the hinterland is not very accessible in the way it is in other continents, and so on. So there are things like that. But above all, it was disfigured by disease. The degree to which malaria was very, very widespread in Africa, and other diseases like sleeping sickness, and of course in the 20th century, HIV, really did set back African living standards. That has something to do with the fact that we are originally an African species, that we've been in Africa longer than any other continent. And that, I think, has meant that more and more pathogens and microbes have had a chance to hone their attack on us in that continent. But as I say, that's changing incredibly fast. The malaria thing is really, really interesting because you get widespread predictions right up until the early 2000s that malaria is going to go on getting worse. And it was getting worse. The mortality from malaria was beginning to improve in Asia, but it was actually getting rapidly worse in Africa.
Why was it getting worse?
Well, because there's more people and there are, basically it's the rising population and not much in the way of public health services or mosquito control and things like that. And then in 2003, the graph suddenly switches. It suddenly starts going down. African malaria mortality starts going down. And it's gone down ever since. What happened in 2003? It's really interesting, actually, and I tracked it down for one of my books, the book about innovation. The Gates Foundation basically picked on one technology and said, we're going to fund this technology. That wasn't a vaccine, and it wasn't an insecticide. It was insecticide-impregnated mosquito nets. Because they were picking up on an experiment that had been done in Burkina Faso in the 1980s, in which they put 36 people in huts specially designed for catching mosquitoes. And they measured how many people got bitten under different circumstances. And they tried mosquito nets, and they tried mosquito nets with insecticide on them. And they found it had a massive deterrent effect. And then they tried tearing holes in the mosquito nets, which is quite often happens. It's very difficult to keep a mosquito net intact. And they found that a mosquito net with holes in it that had insecticide on it was better than a mosquito net that didn't have holes in it, that didn't have insecticide on it. So they realized that this was actually a very cheap technology, very low-tech technology that you could distribute to people, and it wouldn't stop working just because people tore holes in it by mistake. And so they really pushed this technology. And it has made an enormous difference. And I tried to track down the French scientists who worked with the Burkina Faso scientists to do this experiment. I eventually found one of them living in retirement in southern France, because I just thought it was such an interesting story. It's probably it's one of the biggest life-saving stories of the lot. And it's very low tech. It's not all about digital electrons and things. So I kind of like that story.
Yes, so many of the big changes in the world have come from very simple things, like chlorinated water and so on. So we touched on this issue about brains being threat detectors. And so when things are getting worse, we feel that immediately. But why do you suppose progress generally feels so invisible?
I think we take it for granted. When something gets better, we say, fine, I can now use my telephone when I'm walking around. Big deal. I'm cool with that. But the damn thing doesn't work everywhere. So do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so just to give you an example, I went in my first Waymo last November when I was in Austin, and it took me about 10 minutes to get relaxed about having no driver in the car. I mean, it was very easy to get cool about that.
Yeah.
I'm sure within half an hour, I'd be complaining about Waymo not going fast enough or something. But, for God's sake, this is a car driven by a robot. And here am I, somebody who was born in the 1950s, sitting in it, going to my destination, happily chatting to my friend in the back of this car. It's an incredible thing. And so the degree to which we just lock in the things that happen and move on to complaining about the things that don't happen is very, very human.
Yeah, I recently took my first Waymo and I had my kids with me, and I told them, probably uselessly, I said, really pay attention to this, because this is the first time I've ever had this experience. But for you guys, this is just part of the background furniture of the world.
Yes.
And I think our friend Kevin Kelly, I think he was the one who said technology is what gets invented after you're born, and all the stuff that already exists we don't pay any attention to.
He's a one-man oracle on all these topics. He's just so interesting to talk to.
Exactly. Okay, so what I want to ask you about is how we make progress. And in your work, you've emphasized the importance of the exchange of ideas, as you call it, ideas having sex. So tell us about that. Why is recombination more powerful than individual genius?
Right. Well, almost every new device we manufacture, it isn't made from brand new stuff. It's existing stuff reconfigured in new ways. Different combinations of existing atoms, different combinations of existing molecules and substances and so on. So in a sense, all we're doing is coming up with new combinations. Now, as an evolutionary biologist, I see a very close parallel here with what happens in genetics and evolution. That is to say, when a species develops a new gene for solving a new problem, it doesn't do so ab initio. It generally does so by combining different bits of different genes to come up with a new gene. And the process that allows it to do that is called sex. I mean, that is sexual reproduction's main result. I'm not going to say main purpose, because I've written a book saying, well, it didn't know that's what it was going to achieve. But the invention of sexual reproduction several billion years ago enabled us to draw upon innovations in genes that happen to our fathers as well as our mothers. And so if you imagine two different lineages of mammals, and one invents milk and the other invents fur, if they're asexual, there's no chance of getting both. You either have to choose, which do I want, fur or milk, which is the better invention. But if they're sexual, you can say, I think I'd like both those inventions, please. So I think the role of trade and exchange in human society is very, very analogous, if not even homologous, with sex. I mean, when I say ideas having sex, I'm not even speaking metaphorically. I'm trying to be literally true. And I think that's really interesting. Just to give you my favorite, slightly ridiculous example of ideas having sex in technology, there was a technology called the pill camera developed 20 years ago. You swallow it, it takes a film as it's going through your system and gives the doctor an idea of where your problems are if you've got a problem in your gastroenteric system. It came about after a conversation over a garden fence between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. That's a sort of really weird example of ideas having sex.
Yeah. So what conditions have to be in place for innovation ecosystems to really thrive, for ideas to have sex successfully?
I looked at, in my book, How Innovation Works, I sort of told a whole bunch of stories from different areas of technology, and several key themes kept emerging. They all, in the end, boiled down to one word, and that word is freedom. Above all, the freedom to experiment. So if you talk to great innovators, they talk about trial and error. They don't talk, they insist that you never get it right first time, that you don't actually know what you're going to discover sometimes, but you have to fail and fail and fail again and fail again, and then suddenly you start to succeed. So Thomas Edison famously said, I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. And he tried 6,000 different types of plant material before he was satisfied with the type of Japanese bamboo to use for the filament of his first light bulb. Now, I've talked to Jeff Bezos, and he says much the same sort of thing, that if you're not swinging and missing, you're not going to innovate. And people like Edison and Bezos, they're not inventors. They don't come up with brand new prototypes of things. But they are innovators in the sense that they drive down the cost and drive up the reliability and availability of a technology. And for me, that's almost more important than coming up with the first prototype. And it's a sort of reason why, scientists complain, they've run off with my idea and made money out of it. But actually, it's a lot of hard work turning an idea into a practical proposition. So the freedom to experiment, the freedom to fail, the freedom to change directions, it's quite often the case that you set out trying to invent one thing and you end up inventing another. If you're not free to do that, then that's a problem. The freedom to invest, the freedom to meet other people and talk to them. So, there's a reason that innovative societies have tended to have free ports in them, city-states where people are meeting and mixing ideas. One thing that surprised me was that we know big companies are bad at innovation, proportionately speaking. When they get above a certain size, they tend to become anti-innovative. Kodak and cameras, Nokia and data phones more recently. And the reason for that is because they become very centralized and very controlling. And someone, top down starts telling people what to do. The same is true of empires. It's surprising how, the Roman Empire invented very little apart from some decent civil engineering in hundreds of years, despite being a massive free trade zone and a very wealthy one. Much the same is true. The Ottoman Empire invented almost nothing. It banned printing until the 19th century. Most of the Chinese dynasties were very poor at innovating, with the exception of the Song dynasty in particular, which was a ferment of innovation. That's when all the things that we know about, like gunpowder and the compass and so on, came into existence. And the secret of the Song dynasty was that it was actually a very decentralized industry. It was run like a series of city-states with merchants in charge of the cities and the emperor just kind of presiding over it. So for me, the modern history of China is really interesting. So Mao Zedong was like a Ming emperor. He was very centralizing, very controlling, and very little innovation happened under him. Deng Xiaoping, when Mao died, allowed freedom to happen under certain circumstances. And it was, you obviously couldn't suddenly invent a new rival to the Communist Party or anything like that. But if you were starting a small business to invent something new, particularly in one of the free trade zones he set up, like the Shenzhen zone, then actually you faced far fewer obstacles than Western entrepreneurs, because there was none of the local and regional red tape to get in the way. So you were off to the races very quick, with quick decisions and able to do whatever you liked, really, within limits. Xi Jinping is going back to a Ming emperor-style way of behaving. It's like the switch from Song to Ming dynasties, in my view, and is going to kill the goose that lays those golden eggs. He keeps complaining about entrepreneurs having too much freedom and not doing what they're told and not doing what the centralized bureaucracy wants. Now, for the moment, the Chinese economy is thriving as an innovator, but I think it's running out of gas. I think that it's not going to be able to sustain that for much longer. So, by the way, when I was in India last year, speaking at the Jaipur Literary Festival, I said, look, with America retreating behind tariff barriers, Europe stagnating because of red tape, Japan in a bit of a funk, China becoming far too centralized and dirigiste in the way it runs its economy, the job of most innovative economy in the world may be coming vacant. You guys should apply, because India is a very decentralized civilization, very well educated, very good at experimenting and starting businesses and all these kind of things. And it's not a a bet that I'd like to put a lot of money on, but I think India is the economy to watch in the next 50 years.
What do pessimists get right?
What do pessimists get right? Well, some of the extreme pessimists, like the late Paul Ehrlich, who died recently, he really didn't get anything right. I mean, he said my country, England, would cease to exist by the year 2000. He said we would all be starving to death and famine would be terrible. But things like congestion, drug addiction problems, obesity, there are trends going in the wrong direction, obviously. All three of those, to some extent, are problems of success, problems of being too rich, of having too much food, of having access to too many distractions. Screen addiction, I think, is something that people were warning about 20 years ago, and we're now seeing that if anything, they should be more worried about. I personally also think that virology is something that we have not worried about enough. I didn't think this, and when I was writing Rational Optimist, I'm a big fan of biotech generally, but I didn't realize until 2020, when I looked into what that lab in Wuhan had been up to, just how good virologists have got at slotting cassettes of genes into viruses and increasing the infectivity of viruses up to 10,000 times. That's a pretty crazy thing to have been doing. So I'm baffled by the way most people are now saying, oh my God, climate change, oh my God, AI. And I'm saying, you know what? I think you're looking at the wrong scary thing. I think the scary thing is dangerous gain of function in virology, because the pandemic has taught the bad actors, whether it's the North Korean government or the terrorist organizations, that they can bring the world to its knees with a couple of biologists in a dodgy lab somewhere. And we need to do a much better job of monitoring what's going on in places like that. So that's something we need to be a little bit more pessimistic about.
Yeah. I mean, I know there are a lot of people who feel that as we do technological innovation, this can create new categories of risk faster than we can manage them. And you and I are both optimists, and so we know that we will manage them. But how do you respond to that idea? What are your thoughts on that idea that we're creating new categories of risk rapidly?
I mean, I think, of course, we create new categories of risk, and AI is the big obvious one today. But I don't myself see the problems we face today as being any worse, indeed as bad as the ones we faced in, say, the 1970s, when we didn't think we were going to be able to control the population explosion. We weren't sure whether we were going to feed the world. We didn't know whether the communist system was going to overwhelm the world. We were worried about urban air pollution getting worse and worse, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that this is a uniquely dangerous time, I think, just doesn't work for me. What has tended to happen over the past couple of hundred years is that we have devised technical solutions to most of our problems, one after another. And in doing so, we've put them into the rearview mirror and enabled us to go on and look at the next one. Now, you can argue that we don't seem to be able to solve the rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We can't find technologies that can bring that down, at least affordably, yet. And so the energy transition that we want to achieve for that is proving uniquely difficult and it's taking a long time. But it is, I think, the case that some of the problems we suddenly get worried about are problems that wouldn't have bothered our ancestors because they had more important things to worry about. Britain at the moment is very worked up about sewage flows into rivers. These have not got worse. It's just we're now measuring them for the first time. In fact, they've got better, But because we're measuring them, we're saying, oh my God, look how much sewage is getting into rivers. That's outrageous. And that's fine. That's great. Good for us. Well done us for worrying about them. So I don't myself find anything we face to be likely to be insoluble forever. I think the solutions we have at hand are going to be very helpful. Actually, I just want to give you one really good example. There's a friend of mine called Boyan Slat in the Netherlands who was horrified by how much plastic he encountered swimming in the ocean, in the Mediterranean Sea, actually, when he was a boy, determined to do something about it. And he set up a non-profit, which is now huge. It's very successful. It's got a lot of funding from a lot of philanthropists. It's called the Great Ocean Cleanup. And he's improving techniques for catching plastic in the ocean. But the big thing he's achieved so far is interceptors for catching plastic that comes down rivers, because there's the vast majority of plastic that gets into the ocean comes from a certain number of rivers. And it's really spectacular what they're now achieving in terms of catching and disposing of or recycling huge quantities of plastic in certain rivers. There's a river in Guatemala they've recently been working on, for example, another in Indonesia, and so on. Now, the reason I'm telling that story is because he's quite unpopular with a lot of environmentalists. There's some severe criticism of him. Why? Well, they say, well, you'll never clean it all up this way, and you're holding out the hope of a solution when actually there isn't one. Maybe he's going to legitimize the use of plastic again. If he says, look, we've stopped the problem, it's not getting into the sea anymore, let's go back to using plastic straws, because don't worry, they'll never throttle a turtle, then they just don't like that, because they're Puritans, they're ascetics. They want us to stop using this stuff. They don't care why. They just want us to stop using stuff. I'm being a little unkind on them, but you get the point. So the people who come along and solve our problems are quite often pushing upstream when they do so.
Let me just ask you this, because I'm curious what your take is on this. The issue about paying more attention to smaller problems when the bigger problems get solved. I wonder this often when I look at college campuses where young people are protesting things, and when they have things really good, when the world is going well, they seem to get very energized about protesting. And I wonder if this is an expression of the same thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a phenomenon that you have the luxury of worrying about certain things when you don't have to worry about other things. Greg Easterbrook once had a wonderful remark about it. Was something like, sure, people used to be poor and miserable and underfed. Now they're rich and miserable and well-fed. They're still miserable, but it's better to be miserable and well-fed, isn't it? Than miserable and hungry.
Nice. By the way, it's so cool when we look across innovation. There were just two stories when you were talking that it struck me. One was Henry Ford. You may know this quotation. Henry Ford said, "I invented nothing new. I merely assembled the innovations of a century of men before me," which was a nice nod to the fact that he was, bending, breaking, blending, putting things together, remixing things that had come before him. And on the failure point, you almost certainly saw this, but maybe, 6 years ago, Elon Musk released a video of the bloopers from SpaceX, all the crashes. And obviously it's easier to release your blooper footage once you've got a successful spacecraft. But it was lovely to watch that and to really look at the celebration of failure that he did there.
I mean, Elon Musk is the most extraordinary story. And I was pretty skeptical about him for a long time. I thought his attempt to remake the car industry was far too dependent on subsidy and hype, and would probably fall flat on its face. I'd have been shorting his stock if I did that kind of thing, which I don't. And I was wrong. Sure, there's still problems at Tesla, but it's an amazing achievement. I also thought that space was a bit of a sideshow. Fun to do that. And no doubt NASA has been inefficient in various ways over the years, and you could do it better. But really, are you going to really make it cheap enough to do stuff in space? He's brought the price of launching a ton of material into space down by 98%. That's gobsmacking. And I've read Walter Isaacson's biography to try and understand what makes this man tick. And I'm none the wiser in a way. He is so unique and so extraordinary and doesn't come across as sort of particularly brilliant in particular ways. And I think he's a good example, actually, of something, a point I do try and make in my writing on innovation, which is that I don't terribly like the word creativity. You get people saying, I wish we could teach kids to be more creative. I think if we did, we would give them the wrong impression that innovation is done by people of genius who have different blood in their veins. And that ain't true. It's done by ordinary people who have perseverance and imagination to keep trying things and to keep gambling like Elon Musk does. And Edison and Bezos and others do as well. They're ordinary. I want to tell kids, these are quite ordinary people. They're not that different from you and me. It's just they keep trying things, and eventually they stumble on something that works. So anybody could be a great innovator in that sense. I hope I'm right about that. I don't want to, encourage people to go off and think everybody can become Elon Musk, but it's an extraordinary story. And the other thing that, by the way, that he's doing, and I'm really struck by this whenever I'm on the West Coast these days, he is single-handedly helping to solve the conundrum that Peter Thiel put in front of us some years ago, which is that we've got really good at inventing things with electrons, but not very good at inventing things with atoms. In other words, the famous question, where's my flying car? We've done absolutely nothing to improve transport significantly in my lifetime. It's not quite true, of course, but, where's the flying car? Where's the routine space travel? Where's the supersonic airliner? Where's the personal jetpack? Where's the gyrocopter, that we were all promised in the 50s and 60s? Instead of which we had, airport delays and more cup holders in cars for a while. We've got a few things. We've got drones and things now, I'll give you that. But on the other hand, if you read that sci-fi stuff from the 50s and 60s, they hardly mention computing and communication. It's all about transport. And in fact, we've had spectacular changes in communication. The 50 years before that, there was nothing changed. They had the telephone and nothing much else. But they had the first airplanes, the first cars, the first rockets, the men on the moon, all that kind of stuff. So I've lived through the opposite. I've lived through incredible changes in communication and computing and very little change in transport. And I think that's changing because Elon Musk and the people who have spun out of SpaceX, in El Segundo in particular, they're all atoms people. They're all trying to change real things in the real world. I've visited companies that are reinventing supersonic airline engines, companies that are reinventing prosthetic arms for people who've lost a limb. They're not just doing video games anymore. Do you see what I mean? And I mean, you must know more about this, David, than I do. So I'd be interested to know if you think I'm right to be intrigued by this trend.
Oh, I completely agree. What's interesting is that investors still have skittishness about investing in hardware. They love to invest in software. They think it's less expensive, but yes, the progress there has been quite extraordinary. So what do you think it takes cognitively or culturally to maintain a rationally optimistic outlook?
It's surprising how hard it is. I wrote this book 15 years ago called The Rational Optimist. I went around talking about it for a few years, and I would always get people coming up to me at the end of the talks and saying, now, come on, you can't still be a rational optimist. Look what's happening in Ebola, or look what's happening in Syria, or look what's happening in Ukraine. And I would say, yeah, sure, there's bad things happening in the world. I didn't say there weren't. I'm just saying, look what's happening in Africa. Look at the number of people being lifted out of poverty. Look at the number of people not dying of malaria. They're not going to make headlines, but they're happening. And so I would try and say that, but I didn't always convince myself. I'm as susceptible as anyone to getting depressed about the state of the world. And if I read the newspapers, a lot of things make me very grumpy, particularly at 3 a.m, when one's always more grumpy anyway. But the big one for me is the opportunity cost of getting policy wrong, not so much because it means our descendants are going to be poor and cold and hungry, but because our descendants are not going to be nearly as rich as they could be. There's a bunch of scenarios produced for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change called Shared Socioeconomic Pathways, SSPs. And the best of them have us 10 times as rich in per capita income, in real terms, in the year 2100 as we are today, all over the world, on average. That's almost unimaginable. And they describe the world that would achieve this, and they say it's one in which we burn a lot of fossil fuels, and the Gini coefficient of inequality comes right down because poor countries get rich quicker than rich countries. We solve most of our technological problems, most of our environmental problems, most of our social problems. And I'm saying, well, what's the problem? And they say, well, it's going to have more warming. Well, how much more? Well, it's going to reduce GDP by about as much as GDP is today. In other words, instead of being 10.5 times as rich, we're going to be 9.5 times as rich. Okay, is that really such a problem? The opportunity cost of choosing policies that restrain economic growth and innovation for our grandchildren are enormous. And we have to bear that in mind. It's all very well saying we're doing things for our grandchildren, but the best present we can give our grandchildren is a rapid rate of progress.
When you think about the next 50 years, what are you personally the most optimistic about?
AI, genomics, energy. AI is what everyone's talking about. I think it's going to be fabulous. Yes, there are concerns and worries. There always are with every technology, but I'm not convinced it's going to turn on us and destroy us any more than biological species do. Great white sharks and coronaviruses are trying to kill us every day. They don't succeed because of countermeasures. Same will be true of AIs. I also think they're not going to destroy jobs. AI is going to make lawyers and doctors 3 times as productive. That means they can charge 1/3 as much. That means we can hire more of them, and et cetera. So I'm really optimistic about that. Genomics is the dog that hasn't barked yet. We have an incredible opportunity as a result of our ability to read the recipe of our own species and other species. It means we can do really clever things to cure cancer, to combat many other diseases, to improve people's lives in all sorts of ways. We're seeing the fruits of that starting to come through now. It's taken a bit longer than we thought after the Human Genome Project, but it is happening. I suspect, actually, biomedicine is going to be more important than AI. I mean, just look at, GLP-1 agonists. They're having a big effect. You could argue they're a bigger revolution than AI right now. I mean, I'm sure they're not going to be forever, but and I'm sure there'll be side effects and so on. But, we're going to do really smart things in biomedicine. And then finally, energy. I genuinely think we're going to get fusion in my lifetime. I'm 68 years old, though, so it's touch and go. I'm in Sniper's Alley already, so it might not happen. But I think the money that's pouring, the private money that's pouring into fusion, is going to produce results. There's about 4 or 5 different technologies for how to do it. They're all moving towards practical, affordable fusion. If that happens, and if it is affordable, and that, those are big ifs, I admit, it's been over the horizon for 50 years already, then the sky's the limit on how much energy we can provide society. And energy really is the secret of life, because the economy is a thermodynamic thing. We use energy to rearrange the atoms of the world into useful combinations. That's what we do. And the more energy we have, the more we're going to be able to do that, the more problems we're going to be able to solve. You can desalinate water from the ocean pretty well anywhere on the planet if electricity is cheap enough, for example, which, just makes everything from agriculture to cities much more sustainable, and nature reserves too. So those are some of the reasons I'm very optimistic. Oh, and another one, peak farmland. We are now growing more food every year from a smaller acreage of farmland every year. We're shrinking the farming footprint, even as we grow the farming output. That's now been true for about 15 years since we parked peak farmland. We'd be doing it even faster if we weren't doing stupid things like biofuels, by the way, but that's another story. Ethanol and so on. That means that we are returning land to nature. It is happening on a spectacular... The world is now net reforesting. Rich countries are reforesting quite fast. Poorest countries are still deforesting, but in between, there's a lot of countries shifting from deforesting to reforesting. And nature reserves are on the whole getting bigger. So I think that our grandchildren are going to be able to live in a world where the footprint of mankind, both in terms of growing food and in terms of generating energy and in terms of manufacturing, can be really quite small. And the rest of the world can be this wonderful, verdant, green paradise. It'll never be that good, of course, but it's a nice thought.
That was my conversation with Matt Ridley. And the idea of rational optimism is that when you step back and look at the long arc of history, there's evidence for massive progress, like declines in poverty and increases in lifespan, and expanding access to knowledge and to medicine and to opportunity. But the strange part is that people don't like hearing that. Why is it that when you present data about the world getting better, it doesn't land as comforting? It often lands as irritating. I've watched this forever with writers like Matt Ridley and Steven Pinker, who spend years assembling data about long-term improvement. And instead of people saying, oh, awesome, maybe things are getting better than I thought, the reaction is often resistance. Why does it happen? Well, part of the answer lies in the brain. Statistics don't feel like anything, and they very rarely map onto your lived experience because your brain isn't wired to average across billions of lives over decades. It's wired to track your immediate environment, your relationships, your stressors, your sense of how things are going right now. So when someone tells you, hey, globally, things are improving, your brain says, okay, whatever, how do I feel? And if you are feeling anxious or frustrated or angry or whatever, then the statistics bounce right off you. They very rarely penetrate the emotional layer where your sense of the world actually lives. So that's one thing. And also, socially, if you tell other people bad news, that seems to have a kind of moral weight to it. It signals serious and awareness. In other words, if you assert that things are getting worse, that can feel like a more responsible stance, like you're paying attention, like you're not being naive, while optimism can feel like complacency, like you're overlooking problems and you're not taking things seriously enough. So there's a psychological and social pull towards pessimism. And yet, when you step back, you see the pattern, which is that every generation feels this way. Every generation believes it's living through uniquely dangerous times. And that brings me to a line that I've always loved from the American radio broadcaster Paul Harvey, who used to say, "In times like these, it's important to remember that there have always been times like these." I love that line because it reminds us when we're inside our moment, it always feels unprecedented. It always feels like the stakes are higher and the risks are sharper and the future is more uncertain than anything that came before. But any level of studying history will tell you a different story. There have always been threats. There have always been fears. There have always been reasons to believe that things might fall apart. So I want to add one more layer to Paul Harvey's line. In times like these, it's important to remember that previous generations often had it worse. They faced diseases that we can now cure. They lived without technologies that we take for granted. They navigated uncertainties that would feel overwhelming to us today. But progress happened, not without lots of setbacks, but it happened. And that brings us back to the central challenge we have, to hold on to both truths at once. The truth that there are real problems, serious ones and urgent ones that we need to hit hard, and the truth that across time, there has been extraordinary improvement. Part of meeting that challenge is to recognize that optimism doesn't ignore problems. Instead, it's about recognizing that problems are what drive progress. Every challenge becomes a target for innovation. Every constraint becomes an invitation for new ideas to emerge. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. Join the weekly discussions on my Substack and check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.